President Trump is the only chance for the Europeans not to get a war.
So this is Maike Hickson from LSNTV News. I'm very honored and pleased to speak today with Mr. Willy Wimmer, who is a German politician. He was in the German Bundestag for more than 30 years, from 1977 to 2009. And most importantly, was heavily involved with the reunification of Germany in 1990, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the German Berlin Wall, and the fall of communism. He was involved in the negotiations between the West and the East regarding the reunifications and the conditions or the promises made by the West towards the former or then Soviet Union regarding NATO and its role. I would like to go right away into this topic with you, Mr. Wimmer, unless you want to tell us something more about your background that would be important in this context. You would say you were Staatssekretär im Verteidigungsministerium. How would you translate that?
I was number 2 in the hierarchy of the Ministry of Defense.
And in this role, you had a lot to do with the negotiations between.
Yes.
So what would you like to tell an American audience, especially in light of the current Ukraine war, where there is this underlying conflict between, just by the fact that America has been very involved in the Ukraine since latest 2014, and therefore trying to get the Ukraine enter NATO? Is this an alliance or an alignment with what the West had promised Russia at the time?
I think in my understanding, when I look on the German and the European developments, the war in the Ukraine is some kind of a war which has its origin in 1990, and the ongoing development later on with the so-called Wolfowitz doctrine, not to look only on Europe, but to see the development of the globe as a development of a unipolar world being led by the United States. And that is the end of a development which goes back for 35 years, in my understanding, when I look on the situation here. And the situation we have today is very interesting in my understanding, in my German understanding, because we can, because of President Trump, we can let the globe into peace, or to make the same mistakes again as we did it in 1990, and lead the world again in direction of the next conflict. The outstanding situation we have in these days is the person of President Trump. He is the only one who can go for peace, and he is willing to do so. So we have a big chance, the chance we had in the 1990s, and we missed it, but now we have the chance again, and therefore I think it's a very actual observation, not because of the history in the 90s, but of today's development. Mm-hmm. The chance has a name. It's a chance is Trump.
For U.S. residents, creating will has never been easier. Thanks to My Legacy Will, an online platform free of charge, you can now create your own will and choose to include LifeSite News in it. Specify where your funeral will take place, the number of masses to be offered for your soul, and how your estate will be distributed. We would be deeply grateful if you remembered LifeSite News in your will. Visit mylegacywill.com/LifeSite News. Thank you for your support, and may God bless you.
Could we, before we go into our current situation, which we want to hear your opinion about too, because we can really say that you, Mr. Wimmer, have been a voice of peace for a long time, and I would like to review that. But before we go into current discussions, could you just give us an eyewitness of the time? Could you tell our audience what did NATO, what did the United States, what did the West promise? So when you say we missed a chance in 1990, what did we promise, and which promises did we not keep with regard to the Osterweiterung, with the NATO's expansion into the East?
Before I enter into the German discussion on that, I would say, and I should say, that in summer 1990, the NATO summit decided not to continue with the military organization of NATO, but to have it as a political situation in NATO, a more political structure. And we forgot all about these things in summer 92, when the United States under President Carter went for the so-called Wolfowitz doctrine, to have the United States as the only superpower. That was a change in development. When it goes back to 1990, we had a strong development in Germany, a strong opinion to leave NATO because of unification. And this had a name. It was Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister. The other opinion was to continue with NATO as a guarantee for the Western countries to be a good neighbor and to have the same situation with regard to the Soviet Union, to tell the Soviets, at that time the Russians and the others, that we would continue with the same kind of German policy they were used to. So NATO was, in our opinion, a stabilizing factor, and to have an agreement with the Genscher wing in German policy, we decided to continue with NATO only on the West German territory, and even East Germany not to have as part of NATO organization. And that was the German decision, and the German decision was part of the negotiations at the treaties with regard to unification. So we were confident to continue with NATO, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher supported in the end this kind of policy. So it was an internal situation and discussion, and it was an external situation with regard to our Western neighbors, and especially to our Eastern neighbors, including the Soviet Union.
And was NATO at that time, or did the United States, did they make any promises toward the Soviet Union, toward Russia? We won't expand into the former countries under Warsaw Pact.
We have a legion of remarks by leading US politicians, including the president or our foreign minister, Baker, that no inch we would go to the east. So I think, beside of the agreements for German unification, we have a legion of remarks being made by leading US politicians not to continue with expansion of NATO to the east. You believe in that. And we ourselves as Germans, we have experience with US ideas and US ideas when it comes to peace. It goes back to the First World War. We believed in promises being made by the United States, and we got the contrary. And we didn't want to have the same when it comes to 1990 and the expansion of European community or NATO with regard to the East.
Would you just shortly say something about World War I? What would you say, which promises were not kept?
The Germans agreed to the armistice in 1918, including the 14 points of President Wilson, and we got Versailles without recognition of the 14 principles of President Wilson. So we, in one way or the other, we feel to be betrayed. We didn't want to have the same situation after 1990 or in 1990. We wanted to be good neighbors to good neighbors, including our promises.
Yeah, and in a certain way, if we look today at the situation in Europe, when we move a little forward, so the West had said to Russia, we will stay out of your sphere of influence. And then I just look at the list here. I pulled it out of when NATO started move into the East. So in 1999, NATO took Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Czech Republic, and Hungary, welcomed them as members of NATO. 2004, Eastland, Letland, and Romania, Slovenia, and other countries. Then 2009, Croatia, Montenegro. So just from 1999 on, NATO welcomed 14 countries that were formerly a member of the Warsaw Pact, which means that NATO broke its promises.
And beside of breaking the promises NATO had made earlier, there was a new idea in the United States, and I myself took part in the conference, the famous conference of Bratislava in April 2000. There was a strong idea of the State Department expressing these ideas to leading Europeans, and I myself was there in my capacity of OSCE Vice President to have a new Iron Curtain with regard to the Russian Federation in the East, and to split the Russian Federation into 20 or 40 independent sovereign states. So not to continue with the Russian Federation. So NATO expansion and this idea of splitting the Russian Federation, it both came together. And in my understanding, this played an important role when it comes to the Ukraine war.
Could you explain that? And also, where did this plan come from to split the Russian Federation into all these smaller states?
The leadership of the State Department in Washington. It was a conference organized by the State Department in Bratislava, and they explained their ideas to us. And I wrote, as a result of this conference, I wrote a letter to the former German Chancellor. I'm a Christian Democrat. He is a Social Democrat, Gerhard Schröder, telling him that that would be the way to get a war when we continue with such a kind of a policy. And I was, it was a pity, but I was right. We got the war.
I think I read this letter that you just mentioned, and we could put it into the show notes of this interview, even though it's German, but for anyone who would like to research that. That was in the year 2000 when you went to the conference in Bratislava, and you summed up in your letter to Chancellor Gerhard Schröder just simply what you heard at that conference, organized by the US State Department. And that is where these ideas were aired of, how do you call that, nation building of Russia, more or less. I mean, not that this was but the idea, and to reform Russia and instead of leaving it at peace.
First to destroy it and then to reorganize it.
Yeah. And this is, of course, an act of aggression.
Regardless how you might call it, it was at least a kind of a policy which led into the Third World War, in my understanding. And I think we could and we should do our utmost not to have the destruction of the globe.
And I understand that today that is your heartache as a veteran politician who has tried to help his country for many decades, to watch on as Europe is being dragged again, because a lot of the battlefield of the upcoming, threatening, hopefully never happening World War would be on the grounds of Europe.
The interesting thing for me was that in 1988, when I visited Washington as head of the defense group in German parliament, the head of the CIA told us, forget about what we told you about the Soviet threat for decades. The Soviet Union is in a very defensive way in Europe. They want to protect motherland Russia because of Napoleon and Hitler. That was a U.S. remark in the meeting with the defense group.
Mhm.
So this understanding we had in mind when it came to the changed U.S. policy. What is right? What they told us in 1988, or what is going on today?
Yeah.
I think 88 was correct. We saw the whole development in early 89 when the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff went to the Soviet Union with his good friend Marshal Akhmeyev. They had the security advisor to Gorbachev, and they traveled with their families for 2 weeks across the Soviet Union. So this kind of understanding is vital for us.
Yeah, so that's what I would like to also ask you. So we have the reunification of Germany in 1990, and only 2 years later, in 1992, as you just mentioned, the Wolfowitz Doctrine came in, which claimed the United States, let's use that occasion that the Soviet Union is collapsing, let's use this to make America the only superpower in the world. And the consequence, we at LifeSite have interviewed Colonel McGregor in the past, and he has described how in the 90s he was involved with the Balkan Wars, and he saw how this idea appeared in the minds of some of the leading thinkers that there should be a revolution coming from Belgrade, from Sarajevo, leading into Moscow. I mean, the plan was to encroach further closer and to make regime changes all the way up to Moscow. That led to the 1999 Kosovo War. And I know that at that time, you raised your voice then. How did you perceive that war against Yugoslavia, the bombing of Sarajevo? What was that all about?
I fully agree to the remarks being made by Colonel McGregor. And in our understanding here in Germany or in Western Europe, he is perhaps the only one, when he talks, we understand him.
Yeah.
So he explains his ideas so that we can understand an American. And this is vital. I saw it in the 1990s that this way led to war. And the main goal of this war was not Yugoslavia, it was the Russian Federation. And it was mentioned in the negotiations I took part in the 1990s that the war was started because they wanted to at least to get results out of the mistake Eisenhower made in the Second World War, not to have US boots on the ground on the Balkans.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to get rid of this mistake. And therefore, I think we saw the whole development. Kosovo, they talked about Kosovo and they meant Moscow.
Interesting. And I made a mistake with in the interview with Colonel McGregor. I mean, Yugoslavia, Tito was not aligned with the Soviet Union, but would you still consider how was Yugoslavia important to Russia? So how would you hit Moscow if you go into Yugoslavia?
Because they wanted to have the Russian influence driven away from the Adriatic back to the Ural Mountains. That was the general idea in the 90s among NATO people. And that was the general idea they had. And the whole development with regard to former Yugoslavia started even before German unification. The United States had pampered the Belgrade, Yugoslavia, with billions and billions of dollars because of the Soviet Union. And when the Americans saw that the Soviet Union would collapse, they stopped spending money to Belgrade. This created problems in Yugoslavia. At that time, the Yugoslavs asked the European community to spend $4 billion to help them avoid an economical crisis. We didn't do that and paid billions and billions and billions of dollars later as a result of the war. So it was nonsense everywhere.
So would you say definitely they were just looking into stirring up a conflict, playing different regions against each other? I mean, Yugoslavia was a mix of cultures, of nations, which is easily stirred up, that they did that on purpose in order to be able to go militarily in and get the boots on the ground.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you look on the situation in Kosovo, when you look at the situation in former Yugoslavia, they did this, yes. They wanted to have an area of upheavals and just to follow the main track to Moscow.
Protecting your money doesn't have to be complicated. With stocks, bonds, and crypto, it's easy to feel lost. But gold and silver have been trusted for centuries as a simple, stable store of value in uncertain times. If you had invested $35,000 in gold at the millennium, an amount you can give today tax-free to anyone you love, it would have grown to be worth over $325,000. Call our team at 610-326-2000 and let us step you through crafting a solution for your family.
Since we both are Germans, it's kind of funny. We are both German and we talk English. But since we are both Germans, it might be worthwhile to bring this a little bit more to life to the American or English-speaking audience that we have. 1945, 1999, that was how many years? 30 years later. We just had ended World War II with bombings, destruction of Europe. And the Europeans, especially the Germans, had made that commitment. We don't ever want to be having this war or causing this war, this destruction, so many houses, families, lives destroyed. And just 30 years later, we had bombs on European ground again. And just the same now, by the US policy of aggressively pursuing Ukraine as a NATO member, by influencing, as Colonel McGregor also witnessed the Maidan Revolution in 2014, toppling the government that was pro-Russian and replacing it in Ukraine with a pro-American government. The United States are playing a role of provoking with this going and confronting Moscow aggressively, since with the Wolfowitz doctrine, provoking a war that is going to bring back war and has brought back war to Europe. And what would your recommendation be? What should Europe do in this situation?
I think I have no understanding for, and absolutely no understanding for, London or Paris policy with regard to President Trump. In my understanding, President Trump is the only chance for the Europeans not to get a war and to live in peace. And the interesting thing when it comes to American policy is they now try to have friendly relations to the Russian Federation. Since 1860s, and especially after the formation of the German Reich in 1871, the Americans did their utmost not to see a cooperation between the Germans and the Russians. And two wars are a result of such a kind of policy, beside of other reasons. But in these days, President Trump obviously is trying to get a reasonable relationship to the Russian Federation. And we could be a pillar because of this between Washington and Moscow. You have to have a bridge between them, and Europe could be a pillar. And I don't understand the British and the French because of their policy, what's going on to create problems for President Trump where they can do it. I don't understand that.
Would you describe the German government's position right now to our audience? Where does Germany, I mean, Germany has already enormously suffered economically since the outbreak of the Ukraine war. Where is Germany's interest in this?
In my understanding, the actual federal German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is the reason for President Trump to pursue his policy, because Olaf Scholz didn't deliver a special missile which could destroy Russian installations to Ukraine, the famous Taurus. He didn't deliver it to the Ukraine. So we didn't enter the Great War in Europe. So in my understanding, Scholz reason why President Trump could pursue his policy without having a major war with regard to the Russian Federation.
Well, let us hope then, Mr. Wimmer, that your voice be heard in Germany, that the push from Europe comes to find peaceful negotiations and to come to agreement between Ukraine and Russia, that there will be not an expansion of this war and that the suffering in Ukraine may be soon stopped. So we thank you very much for raising your voice with all your experience and expertise over so many years, and for being, thank you so much, Mr. Wimmer, for everything.
Thank you very much. The hope has a name. It's the name is Trump.
Thank you so much. This was Maike Hickson from LifeSite News. Thank you.
Hi everyone, this is John Henry Weston for LifeSite News. We hope you found this video insightful. For more content like this, be sure to check out the links in the description below. You can also follow us on social media to stay updated on the latest news concerning life, faith, family, and freedom. Thanks for watching, and may God bless you.